Today is the Sunday before Advent, which for those of you familiar with Christmas traditions, then you know that this Sunday is Stir Up Sunday. It's known as Stir Up Sunday because the traditional collect for this Sunday starts with the words, "Stir up, we beseech thee, O Lord, the wills of thy faithful people." It's also the day when traditionally people stirred their Christmas pudding. I read that this is a tradition that has almost died out. Only 4% of people who celebrate Christmas make a Christmas pudding. But fear not, Christmas traditions are safe. 13% of people who celebrate Christmas do so with an elf on the shelf. Though how that connects with Jesus is anybody's guess. The current church calendar marks this Sunday by celebrating Christ the King. And that's the theme that I'll be talking about this morning. Before we get into this passage from John 18, which we read this morning, I want you to just take a moment to think, what is the image that comes to your mind when I say Christ the King? What comes into your mind when I say the kingdom of Jesus? We see in this conversation between Pilate and Jesus two very different views of what a king is, of what kingship is, and of what a kingdom is. Although they do not appear in this conversation that we read, the crowd and the Jewish leaders who are part of the story before and after this conversation also have differing views about what kings and kingdoms are. At the heart of these differences are people coming to this from different political perspectives and differing religious perspectives. Pilate is having this conversation with Jesus because he is really wanting to know if Jesus is a political threat to Pilate's power. Is Jesus going to start an armed rebellion against him, and therefore by implication against Rome? Is Jesus going to stop the food and the taxes flowing from this area back to Rome, which is one of the reasons why Rome occupies this region? Is Jesus going to do something that would stop Pilate's upward career path? What Pilate does not want is another Maccabean result and the creation of another Jewish king. Pilate was a politician and a military man. He was happy to use violence to get what he wanted. He had contempt for the Jews, and most likely he would have had a network of informers, so he would have known about Jesus and what he had been doing. From the conversation between Pilate and Jesus, it seems to me that Pilate did not see Jesus as a political threat, either to himself or to Rome's authority, even if Jesus did call himself a king. The incident in the Garden of Gethsemane, where Peter cuts off the soldier's ear and Jesus puts it back on, is not really the action of a man about to start an armed insurrection. And that was what Pilate was mainly worried about. He did not care about the internal arguments between Jesus and the Jewish leaders. He was happy to let the Jewish leaders sort that out themselves. In contrast, the charges that the Jewish leaders brought against Jesus through the religious courts was blasphemy, that Jesus was claiming to be God. This was a purely religious charge. However, they wanted to get Jesus out of the way, but only the Romans could execute someone, and the Romans would not do that for a charge of blasphemy. So instead, they went to the Romans with a charge of Jesus being a king. This was a direct challenge to Caesar's authority as emperor, and something that the Romans could execute Jesus for. Jesus does not deny that he is a king or that he has a kingdom, but that still leaves us with the important question as to what sort of king Jesus is and what sort of kingdom is Jesus' kingdom. I think it's clear from the conversation that the type of kingdom that Jesus and Pilate were talking about were different types of kingdoms. So what we are interested in is the type of kingdom that Jesus is king over. To answer that, it will be helpful to look at the role of kings within Jewish history. The early history of the Jewish people up through the time of Judges, God was king of the nation. God was the Lord, Yahweh, the great I am. It is during this time that Samuel and the people demanded a king. They wanted a king so they could be like other nations. They wanted a king who could lead them out into battle. In one sense, this can be seen as a rebellion against God. The people wanted a human king to lead them rather than having God lead them. If we think back to the Battle of Jericho, The whole point of having the army march around Jericho blowing trumpets was to show it was God winning the battle and not Joshua. The people wanted to follow what the pagan nations are doing rather than follow God, rather than being obedient to God. There is a split with the priests overseeing the religious life of the nation and the king overseeing the secular life of the nation. As we read on through the books of Kings and Chronicles, we see the tension that this creates as the religious and secular areas are at odds with each other. Israel is not like the pagan nations. It is God's chosen nation. They are God's chosen people. But the Bible judges the majority of these kings as not being good. All the kings in the northern kingdom were bad as they continued to worship pagan gods. With only a couple of notable exceptions, all the southern kingdom kings were also not good. When we get to the time of the exile and the post-exilic period, there are no kings. But it's during this period that we see more of the prophecies of the Messianic king. We see these coming in Isaiah, Jeremiah, Micah, Zechariah, and Daniel. We start to see this idea of a king that will come from the line of David to be a king over Israel, and also a king that will rule over all the nations, a king over all the world. These pick up ideas that are there in Moses and in Samuel, but are more explicit in these later writings. In the intertestamental period, we get the Maccabean rebellion, where they create a new Jewish kingdom against the then occupying power. But by the time of Jesus, these have been replaced by Rome as the ruling power, and Israel, again, has no king. The world that Jesus comes into is coloured by and influenced by all of this history. When people in the Gospels are talking about a king, then the idea of what a king is or should be is influenced by at least one of these historical ideas about kings and kingdoms. For Pilate, the ultimate king was Caesar in Rome, and the last thing he wanted was another rebellion of people wanting to create an independent Jewish state within his territory. Pilate had good reason to worry about that, as there were people who did want to create an independent Jewish nation outside of Roman rule. We see some references to this in the Gospels, where it's recorded that people wanted to make Jesus a king, and sometimes by force. But some of the Jews, there was a desire for a king who would in effect recreate the kingdom of David from the past, to recreate the kingdom that was promised to Moses at the Exodus and that was lost at the time of the exile. For others, there was more of a longing for a messianic king who would not only restore Israel, but who would usher in a kingdom where God ruled over all the earth and where God ruled all the nations. A king who would judge all the nations of the world. What we are seeing in this Jewish thought about a kingdom are two strands. One is the actual kingdom, an area of land for the Jewish people that is ruled over by a Jewish king. It's a desire for an actual nation state of Israel. The other side is a more end-of-time messianic view, where a king from God will come and rule over not just Israel, but all the nations. A king who will judge all the nations. A king above all kings. So that brings us, after a long preamble, back to the passage and Jesus' response to Pilate when he says, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. But now my kingdom is from another place." We have already seen how Jesus stopped Peter using his sword to protect Jesus. Nowhere do we see that Jesus was intending to create a typical earthly kingdom. Jesus was not going to recreate the nation state of Israel, and neither was he about to start a rebellion against Caesar or Rome. So what is Jesus' kingdom? Does this mean that Jesus' kingdom was a completely spiritual kingdom with no presence on earth? Well, I think the answer to that is both yes and no, which brings us to the heart of what the kingdom of God is. If we can understand what the kingdom of God is, then we can understand Jesus as king. As we read the first three Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we see in them how Jesus does a lot of teaching about the kingdom of God. The phrase, "the kingdom of God is like," is repeated many times. Jesus is giving moral and practical teaching to the disciples and to the crowds about how they should be living their lives and how they live as part of the kingdom of God. The implication from this is that part of how we understand the kingdom of God is that it exists here and now. It exists in this world. It exists in how we live our lives. There is a sense that the kingdom of God is all of us as Christians, as we live our lives in obedience to God and follow and live out the teachings of Jesus. In this sense, the kingdom of God therefore exists in this world, but it does not have a geographical location. It is not a nation that appears on a map. This is what is implied in John chapter 4, as Jesus is talking to the Samaritan woman at the well, when he says, "They will worship neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem, but will worship in spirit and truth." The kingdom of God is therefore not geographical. The physical manifestation of the kingdom of God is where people are worshipping God. It is where people love God with all their heart and soul and mind, and love their neighbours as themselves. It is where people are living out the Nazareth manifesto of preaching good news to the poor, sight to the blind, freedom for prisoners and the oppressed. It is where people are living out the Sermon on the Mount. It's where the hungry are fed, the thirsty have water, those in need clothed, the sick looked after, and the prisoner visited. The other side to Jesus' kingdom is the sense of an eschatological kingdom. This is the kingdom that Jesus will bring in when he comes again to judge the world and to be king of all nations. Again, this is a kingdom that is unlike any other kingdom. This is the kingdom that will come at the end of the age. Both of these interpretations of the kingdom that Jesus is king of are very different to the one that I think Pilate was imagining. One interpretation is a kingdom without borders, and one interpretation is of a kingdom yet to come. What this does highlight is how we live in this world, but we are not of this world, of how we live in the kingdom that is not yet fully realized. The kingdom of Jesus has this sense of being now and also not yet. We live as part of the kingdom, and yet that kingdom has not been fully realized until Jesus comes again. I started this talk by asking, what came into your mind when I said Christ the King and the kingdom of Jesus? Perhaps you thought of Jesus riding into Jerusalem on a donkey on Palm Sunday, or perhaps you thought of the second coming of Jesus when he returns in all his glory to judge the world. I'll leave you with a picture that means something to me, and hopefully it might resonate with you as well. I want us to move forward from the trial in front of Pilate, past the cross, past the empty tomb, past the resurrection, to the encounter on the beach with Jesus and Peter. This is Jesus as he has completed his mission on earth. He has saved the world. He has taken upon himself on the cross all the sins of the world, and he's about to ascend back into heaven. This is the Jesus who was there in the creation of the world and will return as judge of all nations. And what is he doing? He's standing on a beach with an old beat-up frying pan over a wood fire, frying fish. I'd like to think he has 2 fish and is cutting up 5 loaves. The great mystery and wonder of Jesus is that he is both king and he also dresses and acts like a servant. Jesus is not a normal king. Jesus' kingdom is not a normal kingdom. Pilate could not understand who Jesus was. We have the privilege to worship Jesus as creator and sustainer of the universe, as the judge of all nations. And at the same time, we can have an intimate and personal encounter with Jesus, as Peter did on the beach. Next week, as we start Advent, we think about Jesus returning in glory, and then we come to Christmas, and we think about Jesus coming in his humanity. My prayer is that we will encounter Jesus both in all his glory and majesty, and also in the humbleness of his humanity.